Hello, and welcome to the weekly sermon podcast with Reverend Marie Duquette. You can find the full live version service on YouTube's Be Ye Lifted.
Hear the Gospel according to Matthew chapter 27, beginning with verse 11. Now Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor questioned him, saying, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus said, "You say so." And when he was accused by the chief priests and elders, he did not answer. Then Pilate said to him, "Do you not hear how many accusations they make against you?" And he did not answer him, not one word, so that the governor was greatly astonished. Then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the governor's command post, and they gathered the whole cohort around him. They stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him, and having woven a crown of thorns, they put it on his head, along with a reed in his right hand. And they knelt before him and mocked him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they spat on him and took the reed and struck him on his head. After mocking him, they stripped him of the robe and put his clothes back on him. Then they led him away to be crucified. Now going out, they found a Cyrenian man named Simon. This man they conscripted to carry his cross. And coming to a place called Golgotha, which means skull place, they offered him wine mixed with vinegar to drink. But when Jesus tasted it, he would not drink. And when they had crucified him, they divided his clothes among themselves by casting lots. Then they sat down, and keeping watch over him there, they placed over his head the charge written as, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." The Gospel of the Lord. Let's begin by looking at two things from this Gospel, one at the top and one at the bottom. At the top of this reading, at the end of the first paragraph, verse 14, the word translated as astonished is equally translated as impressed. And he did not answer him, not one word, so that the governor was greatly astonished, or the governor was greatly impressed. That makes a difference in how you hear it, right? Jesus does not respond even one word to Pilate's question, despite Pilate having the power to cause Jesus immeasurable pain. And Governor Pilate was greatly astonished or greatly impressed. And speaking of prophets and prophecies, in verse 35, the words translated as "they divided his clothes by casting lots" is word for word what was written more than 600 years earlier in Psalm 22:18, a psalm typically reserved for Good Friday. With these readings, we end our church year on this day known as Christ the King Sunday. Next week, we will begin to tell the story all over again, this time according to Matthew. During the last several weeks, we have heard numerous accounts of the rise and fall of Israel's monarchies. Monarchies are, of course, a human institution, and as so many human institutions, were doomed to fail, although some took their time doing so. So why keep using this kingdom language? Why celebrate Christ the King when king, in numerous accounts throughout the ages, equates to men driven by power, corruption, unchecked and unmedicated madness, narcissism even. Men who rarely served the people over whom they reigned, and all too often exploited, unjustly imprisoned, or simply ignored them and their very real needs that they had for no fault of their own. The short answer is because the concept of monarchies, kingdoms, and kingdoms give us a language for God that is imperfect but familiar. If I were to ask 30 people to give me a relevant current day word or expression that comes to mind when I say the word king, with no other context, we could easily hear 30 different answers. Game of Thrones, Dungeons and Dragons, King Friday, Scar, the Skeleton King, Black Panther, and of course, Stephen. What we the people often miss, however, is that Jesus takes this familiar language and inverts its meaning. The reign of God and its majesty are quite different from the world's understanding of what it means to reign, to rule over, to be the top dog. Reverend Dr. William Barber, activist and co-director of the Poor People's Campaign, finds scriptural support for those on the margins leading social justice movement. Dr. Barber builds on Psalm 118. The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This is God's work, and it is marvelous in our eyes. The rejected must lead the revival for love and justice. The cornerstone is that part of the foundation upon which the whole building stands. And the psalmist says, speaking metaphorically, of how we view human beings in society, that it is God's intent that the stones that were once seen as unfit to be a part of the architecture, the stones that were once thrown away or kept in the quarry, have now been called to be the most important stones. The rejected stones make the best cornerstones. The rejected stones actually make the best foundation holders. And whenever you see rejected stones becoming the focus of society, it is the Lord's doing. Last week, I asked you to begin contemplating 3 questions. How has the pandemic changed you? How has the pandemic changed the church? What has happened to you in the time we spent apart that you need to talk about in a community of belonging, one that imperfectly strives to love and include those that society rejects, scorns, and persecutes? Did you receive a medical diagnosis that sets you back on your heels? Do you need to talk about mental illness, your own or that of someone you love, but you are afraid you or they will be further stigmatized if you talk about it? Did someone you love come out as trans or non-binary or afab? Are you confused about how you can best support them when the truth is you are still learning what these terms mean? Does a younger person in your life now show a lack of interest in anything, as if they have no confidence they will have a future at all? Is your income or your retirement fund dwindling and you don't know how to fix it? Did you lose way too much money playing bingo on your cell phone? Are you ashamed to talk about it? Are you overwhelmed with insurance claims, medical bills, and children's schedules, a car that would be easier to donate to NPR than to continue repairing, an upcoming trip to see relatives when you would actually prefer to stay home? Have you become estranged from your son or daughter, your mother or father? Is your heart aching in the wake of their ongoing silence? Have you lost friends across the divides in this country? Do you miss them? Do you wonder how to love someone who you now realize has a worldview that is radically different than your own? Are you terrified of getting COVID and also terrified of being alone as much as you have been in the last 2.5 years? Do you still miss your beloved pet who died months ago, but it seems trivial to mention in light of all the other tragedies of late? Do you have no idea how to even bring up any of these topics? If any of these questions resonated with you, hear the truth from our merciful God. Jesus lived among the rejected. He ministered among the rejected. He died and was crucified as rejected, as somebody who was outside the political power structure. He was unable or perhaps unwilling to defend himself against the charges that resulted in his violent death. An early Sunday morning, while it was still dark, the same Jesus rose from the grave to be the King that led a resurrection movement, a revival of love, a revival of justice, a revival of mercy, a revival of grace, that his most attentive and transformed followers have continued for more than 2,000 years. It is a revival that paved the way for us to say decidedly that love is love, for same-sex marriage to become legal in this country and 31 others now. It is a revival in which love for this beautiful planet has moved virtually all of the world's largest companies to respond to climate change with goals outlined in annual sustainability reports. More than 2,000 companies have set a science-based carbon target. About 1/3 of Europe's largest public companies have pledged to reach net zero by 2050. It is a revival that has companies and houses of worship radically expanding their diversity and inclusion efforts, committing funds to fight racial inequity, and speaking out on societal issues they used to avoid. It is a revival in which Dr. William Barber picked up the mantle of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and moved the Poor People's Campaign forward. It is a revival in which women not only began to preach, but to become surgeons and speakers of the House and vice presidents and surgeons and physicists and cement workers. It is a revival of love, powered by a resurrection that made known the radical idea that it is life and not death that has the last word. And as we wrap up our year of listening to and reflecting upon the Reverend Dr. Wilda Gaffney's translations of Scripture, let us remember that this Hebrew scholar is a woman who descended from a people who were enslaved in this country not that long ago. This brilliant teacher who has helped us see that the Bible is filled with women whose stories have mostly gone untold until she decided to use her gifts to center them, that we might see our stories in theirs and God's story in all of them. Given that, I close this last sermon of the church year with words Dr. Gaffney wrote specifically for this strange Sunday we call Christ the King, and she calls Majesty of Christ. Listen to the words of this current day prophet. To the fallen Judean monarchy and their Babylonian colonizers and occupiers, Jesus says the poor of the land who were deemed not worth the labor to even deport are at the heart of the reign of God. The majesty of Christ is not found in treasures of temple or palace, burgled and broken apart, but in a crown of thorns, beaten in by bullies, and in his battered and denuded body. This human, mortal, woman-born Jesus is the glory and majesty of God, in the words of the epistle to the Hebrews. The brilliance of God's glory and reproduction of God's very being. That humanness, shared with every girl and woman, every boy and man, every non-binary child and adult, is also the majesty of Christ and our own.
You just heard from Reverend Marie Duquette, pastor at King of Kings in Ann Arbor, Michigan. You can help support this ministry by texting your contribution to 833-950-1405. That's the U.S. 833-950-1405. You can find the full service video on YouTube Live at BU Lifted. Drop us a comment or join us on live chat at 9:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time Sunday mornings.